I am Beth Mashesky. I am with the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, and that's part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. Our land grant acknowledgements, as a land grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has the responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we will begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Yankashaw, Waya, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community, inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. This webinar and all of the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars are certified green events through the University of Illinois Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. To find out more about certified green events through U of I, please visit sustainability.illinois.edu. To find out more about the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars, please visit istc.illinois.edu/events. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available online in about a couple weeks. I'll be sending an email out to everyone who registered for the webinar once those are available. I ask that everyone remain muted until the end of the webinar. Then we'll take questions at the end. You can either type in your questions through the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question live. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Deanna Hens. Deanna is an associate professor in the Department of Climate, Meteorology, and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and is the engagement and partnerships lead for the Institute for Geospatial Understanding for discovery through an integrated discovery for iGuide, which engages interdisciplinary geospatial research towards problems of resilience and sustainability. Her research program uses observations from the field experiments combined with high-resolution numerical modeling to study the interactions of high-impact convective storms systems with their environments, and how the evolution of these storms influences their impacts on human systems. She merges these interests into societally oriented, community-driven, interdisciplinary research that fosters inclusive science, communication, and solutions-focused conversation. So Deanna, thank you for joining us, and the webinar is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, sorry that I know that institute name's quite a mouthful, so it's not the smoothest one to trip off the tongue. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me to talk about I think probably one of my favorite topics, which is, field campaigns and how we do them. And I really want to emphasize here the name, the subject of the talk, the title, and that it is, intentionally a bit of a double, if not a triple entendre, in that it's, we learn a lot about how the atmosphere works and its various impacts through studying it in the field. We also learn a lot about ourselves, about our societies, about science itself in doing these experiments. And we're having to learn a lot now about how we need to change how we do some of these things to better make sure that our science is serving society. And so this talk is going to be a bit of a trip through my own history in dealing with these different field operations over my career, both as a student and then later on. And I hope that it will inspire some discussion about how we need to move forward into the future. So just to give you some context about my career, I realized just actually as I was making this talk that I've been doing these field campaigns for about 21 years. My very first one was as an undergraduate student, and you can see me pictured here as that student back in 2003. This is me standing next to a research aircraft with my research mentor, Wen Chao Li. And at the time, I was an undergraduate as part of the National Center for Atmospheric Research SOARS program, which was basically an internship program meant to help broaden the participation of underrepresented groups in the atmospheric sciences. That program is rooted in Boulder, Colorado, just for some context. So when I was assigned to this particular research mentor, that particular research mentor was actually out in the field. He was part of a field campaign operating in Southern Illinois. So after about a week of leadership training with that particular internship program, I was sent out into the field to be with him. So, you notice that we're standing on a tarmac in front of a plane while we had a bunch of research aircraft meant to study these kinds of storms. Now, this particular radar image is not of one from that campaign. This is much newer than that, but just to give you a visual example of what one of these types of storms that we're studying looks like. This was a campaign known as the Bow Echo and MCV experiment, also known as BAMX. And basically, that's just a way of saying that we were studying these kind of long, linear storm systems that had these distinctive curves to them, like the one you see in the radar image on the left. We were using both ground crews driving around, to take measurements from the ground, and also aircraft. And you can see me standing next to one of the NOAA hurricane hunters, which was being used for this campaign in the hurricane off season. So why is all this important? Well, for one, it was this campaign that made me want to go into what I do now. That experience was very transformative for me as a student who, before this point, really didn't have a good idea of all of the breadth of the atmospheric sciences and what it can do and what it can study. So my love of field research was fully realized in this campaign. And this was in 2003. But it also raised a fair set of challenges that this is the first one I'm going to kind of focus on here. And that is that this kind of work is actually pretty dangerous. What we call a derecho, which is a very severe form of that kind of large thunderstorm complex, that they have very powerful winds that can be as strong or stronger sometimes than a tornado. And in fact, one of the storms that hit during the campaign spawned a tornado directly next to our operations center, and we had to shelter from that in the middle of a field operation. That's not that was the first time, but it certainly was not the last time that what I was trying to study actually tried to hurt me. So, so there is, of course, that risk from the thing that you're trying to study itself. It can be your typical set of, your kind of severe or hazardous weather threats, like that comes with thunderstorms or other types of phenomena. And that can be like extreme wind, tornadoes, heavy rain, which also brings flooding, lightning or hail. Like this is a picture of some hail collected during a different field campaign I was a part of. A majorly estimated one is the impacts of heat. And that can be underestimated because that can get you even during all the downtime when you're sitting around bored and the storms haven't formed yet. If you're really into winter storms, of course, cold or hyperthermia and also ice can present significant hazards as well. with all of that, that comes, of course, your typical impacts of those kinds of storms, like destroyed infrastructure, downed power lines, damaged buildings, blocked or flooded roads that may interfere with your ability to operate, get around, get home, all that kind of stuff. And then, speaking especially of roads, they themselves can pose their own problem. A lot of field campaigns, we have ones that operate by air and aircraft, by sea on ships. We have spaceborne instruments that we use, but a lot of field campaigns also operate on the ground, driving around instrumentation. So we are often collecting data on the side of the road, as you can see here, standing next to a highway in Argentina, and let alone that we have to drive often long distances to get to those location sites. So that presents not only opportunities for accidents just by, probability, but also because of the types of phenomena involved. In one instance, professional storm chasers have been killed in car crashes with other people who are trying to chase those tornadoes for commercial instances like tour groups and things like that. But it's also just a very exhausting process, which can lead to lapses of judgment when driving and things like that as you're driving long and very late hours. But another thing that is also a particular consideration when we're doing these kind of operations is that we are also very highly visible to passerbys. And that can lead to some unwanted attention as well. So just as an example of this, around a time that that particular photo was taken, I was the PI of a completely female sounding team at that particular moment. And we were getting catcalled the entire time that we were launching balloons there. Thankfully, there were no more direct interactions, but that was still a problem that we had to deal with. Other researchers have reported being threatened, being demanded payment for the right to measure where they were doing their thing, or being suspected as being spies or various other things. I had one friend whose instrumentation, thankfully, when he was not there, being used for target practice by hunters. So these are some of the different kinds of considerations that we have to take into account when we're operating in the field. So my next field experience was actually, by this point, I was in graduate school, and we were about to fly a bunch of aircraft into hurricanes. And so I had to go through a series of specific trainings to be able to fly on a Navy aircraft. So we had some particularly bizarre training experiences doing AI flight simulators and having to swim out of a submerged fuselage and full flight kit, things like that. And that was all just to be able to fly on this plane because the radar data, the radar whose data I was going to be working with is sticking out of the back of a Navy aircraft, right? Well, so that introduces issue number two, in that field operations put you under intense physical and psychological stress. That can happen in any number of ways. And some of those ways have been getting more and more attention in recent years as people have begun to realize the disparate nature of these impacts. The first ways start pretty much the second you land at the site. You are frequently very far from home and all the different comforts that you may be used to. The place, the food, the language may be strange to you. And just as an example, when I did the campaign in Argentina, which is going to come up a lot in this talk, uh, for me, it was the fact that the rental car that I had was a stick shift, and I had to drive that truck from the airport to the hotel. I'd also never experienced driving in Argentina, so I got a crash course in both of those things just in the time it took me to drive from the airport to the hotel after I had just experienced a very long overnight flight. So by the time I got to the hotel, my hands were like this around a steering wheel because I was, like clawing it for dear life because I was so stressed. And that was just the start of my arrival, right? So the other thing that especially has gotten more attention in recent years is disparate access to necessary facilities. So as an example, many times we're operating in remote areas, although not always, and I'll get to that later. Um, and so access to toilets may not be a thing. Well, uh, that part was appreciated from the beginning, but the part that was missed and underappreciated until recently is that, well, doing your business on the side of a road can be much more problematic for some people than for others. Bathroom access can be much more problematic for some people than others, especially given how politically heated things like that have become in recent years. This can also extend to access to things like medicine, clinics, healthcare, in some of these different places, if health issues arise, which they frequently do, again, due to all the stress that one is under during these campaigns. So all of this can lead to intense feelings of isolation, especially if you're the one or one of very few who are uniquely experiencing that hardship or those challenges. So that's just getting used to the area that you're in. It's already a very new and frequently very foreign to you environment. Once a campaign itself starts, things can get even weirder, right? Because, of course, by nature, um, a lot of field campaigns, but especially of the type that I typically do, which deals with a lot of very extreme weather, um, they tend to be a mixture of extremely high intensity with extreme boredom. It can be a lot of hurry, 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 then wait, and then wait and wait, and then hurry, hurry, hurry. And so it's a lot of whiplash of high intensity, low intensity, high intensity, low intensity. Um, Another thing that is part of that is that, well, the weather doesn't wait for anybody, right? So the nature of both the travel to your collection sites or the type of weather that you're trying to study can often result in you having very long and very strange hours. These pictures on the left, just as an example, are from two different campaigns. The top one is from us doing data collection late into the night. And the bottom one was us getting ready for data collection very early in the morning. That's not unusual. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to study. Um, Even if you are stationary, not having to drive, you may have to pull really long overnight shifts or very, very long stints in an operation room, just due to what you're trying to do. So now, of course, you're having very highly intense experiences over long and strange hours. Maybe you're really stressed, maybe you're really tired, and that can lead to where the social dynamic can start to play in because these campaigns are often highly multi-institutional. It may be you and several other universities and government agencies and all these other groups. That means that you may be working with people you are familiar with and you know, and it often means that you will be working with plenty of people you don't. There can be very strong personalities involved. Um, and there can be a lot of conflicts in institutional or organizational norms that can result. And these all get amplified when you're in a very highly intense situation that is very high stress. And so, as I mentioned, that can lead to a lot of conflicts with cultural norms, both within the team, but also with the surrounding host environment. Um, And this is an issue because it's through these types of field operations that a lot of the cultural norms of science are really, really intensely drilled into people. And that happens through a lot of those intense, very long duration interactions between senior scientists and trainees and staff and engineers and all the people that are involved in this. That can be a good thing because that can really inspire a lot of closeness that would go beyond what you would normally see in a kind of more low pressure professional environment. Um, so the thing is about that is that depending on how those interactions go, those interactions can be enough to inspire a lifelong scientist, or, and unfortunately, I've seen both of these things, it can be enough to drive someone completely from the field forever because their experience was so terrible. Um, a lot of these more negative experiences have especially been known to happen during more social times of the campaign, especially after data collection, and especially when there can be either a lot of alcohol, other drug influence, or just slap happy exhaustion where people's inhibitions are really lowered and those things get involved to make for a lot of compromising and uncomfortable situations. So you may hear this and be like, okay, well, then why go through all this? Well, of course, it's because for some understanding of certain phenomena, there's literally no other way to get the data that we need to better understand them right now. So just as an example, this particular campaign, the 2005 RAINX campaign, was one I did. It was my very first campaign as a graduate student. So this was after the BOECA one that I mentioned at the start. So that's me in a flight suit. This is after this was the campaign where all the crazy swimming in a submerged fuselage training was for. Um, and on this particular field campaign was the exact same mentor that I had back in 2003. And in fact, he went on to be on many of the same field campaigns that I was on because we studied a lot of the same things. I mean, I was a trainee in that, and it's natural that I moved on into continuing to work in that area. Um, I have a career-long bond with that mentor, both because of that experience and that repeated interaction with him over the years. Um, but it also gives example of how small this world of atmospheric science field research can be. And so that's also highlighting why those relationships being positive can be so incredibly important. So we go through all this effort of, again, long flight hours, um, in, arguably dangerous conditions, although we're with highly trained pilots and all that. So it was, as about as safe as it could be functionally to collect um, this data set. And it was the first of its kind at the time. This flight that's pictured here happened to be in Hurricane Katrina. And this was the first full mapping of a hurricane rain band with this highly detailed radar. These hurricane rain bands with this highly detailed radar. Um, but two distinctive things happened during this campaign on the, not so great side. One was that Hurricane Katrina hit Miami before it hit Louisiana. The apartment I was staying in was in Miami, and so my apartment, while I was away doing the flight campaigns, my apartment was flooded. So it was handled, it was okay, but that's just again when we talk about the actual danger that these phenomena can pose. But the other instance was something that was more in the control of the campaign itself. On a different flight into Hurricane Katrina, I was on a different plane with a different crew. And it turned out that their standard practice was to go to a particular chain of restaurants that was known both for its fried chicken wings and also a particular type of attire of their waitstaff. And that's the kind of situation where, especially as a trainee, um, I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know what to do. I rolled with this very awkward situation the best I could. And so this is an example of an age-old problem that has existed in many professions for a long time. And this is the issue of when professional and social interactions are combined, because it can be an inherently double-edged sword. On one hand, especially in these highly intense situations, you need to be able to work extremely closely together. And so it is beneficial for people to get to know each other on a more than very distant professional level. Furthermore, and this is where the conundrum lies, engaging in that social part of these interactions can be absolutely critical to obtaining future opportunity in relationships. However, and this is where the other side comes in, some of the ways that that has been historically done can lead to exclusion of people, either just flat out leaving them out, or people self-excluding themselves because that environment makes them justifiably extremely uncomfortable. Or for those who choose to participate in it for the sake of their careers, it can put them in very compromising positions. And so that issue of how do you make those social interactions that are necessary um, fair, equitable, and inclusive is a major issue going forward. And so that is an inherent challenge of when we think of especially the physical sciences, is that it is an inherently social affair. Although we may be after trying to understand a physical question, the effort to get that data is an intensely social matter. And so, and this is getting even more complicated as the questions that we're trying to address with these operations are becoming inherently more and more and as much social as it is physical when we think about problems around, like, especially climate change, sustainability, and resilience. So that merger of the two, both in terms of the questions, but also in terms of the operations and interactions, is getting increasingly more complex. The reality is that before, during, and after a very long day of decision making, sampling, whatever it is that you're doing, we are both interacting with each other and with the surrounding community around us. We have to eat, sleep, bathe, drive, be seen throughout the area that we're operating, often together for very long periods. So that means that we have to work together at very high professional standards to get what we need to get done, but also because we're inherently representing both our institutions and the science that we're trying to do to the world around us. So that can mean a whole lot of different things within a field operation, but I'll just focus on a few. The first is that we have to handle conflict and misunderstandings healthily and professionally. And that does mean actually handling the conflict and not avoiding it. One thing that can be a challenge is that in the effort to be collegial, people may try to kind of look away from or brush away a conflict because they are concerned that it could cause a disruption if they try to, if they try to deal with it. And so they may try to ignore it. But the thing is, again, in my experience, and I'm skipping over a bunch of them, honestly, there have been campaigns that have just outright failed because one or a few very strong personalities got into an irreconcilable conflict. But there have also been campaigns that failed because people avoided handling the conflicts altogether until they kind of, boiled over and got out of control. So defining that decision-making process from the get-go and then enforcing it is extremely important and has to be done at the beginning, and it needs to be clearly communicated to all involved. So, of course, in dealing with these issues around equity, an important part of handling conflict is realizing the difference between intent and impact. And those things can lead to a lot of very strong feelings. It can lead to a lot of defensiveness. It can lead to defending practices that don't serve well anymore as, well, that's how we've always done it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. The other thing, of course, is, as I was pointing out before, making sure that these interactions, both the professional and social ones, are equitably accessible. This can mean anything from, of course, as like I said, the involvement of alcohol is one that has gained a lot of attention over the years, but this can range everywhere from the diversity and the types of interactions that happen. Is that assuming people's time availability, their care responsibilities or lack thereof, any number of religious conflicts or other cultural conflicts that may arise from that? The timing, locations, assumptions of transportation ability or lack thereof, etc. All of that needs to be considered when you're thinking about making these opportunities accessible. And along those lines, all of these things also apply to thinking about how we meaningfully engage the community around us as well. Um, One huge challenge of a lot of these field operations is how do you meaningfully engage the community within the time, personnel, and budget constraints that you may have, and you almost certainly have. I mean, there's no may about it, right? Um, it is fairly standard for a lot of field campaigns to do, community outreach. And that is, typically defined as you go for one or a few key periods. You have a day engaging with, community groups, school groups, like the one in the picture on the top, where I'm talking with some students about the campaign. Media interactions are frequently involved in this. This is me pictured with a different campaign. I'm talking with the media. And one thing, the reason why these are really well liked is because they are an efficient way to have a very wide reach with a short amount of time, especially again, given all the long hours of stress, everything else that I just talked about. And, do not get me wrong, I personally love doing these types of activities. They're very fun. I get to meet lots of very interesting people, and I learn a lot from the people that I meet in these interactions. However, and this is again, the double-edged sword of this, there has been a lot more attention paid in recent years to an idea of helicopter science, and essentially where someone decides there's a problem, they swoop in, they do a bunch of work, they do some one-off interactions with community members, and then swoop away, never to be seen again, right? This approach is lacking relationship building frequently, and it also lacks capacity building within the impacted community. So it can do a lot to inspire people and maybe even inform or educate to a certain extent, especially if there is a lot of interaction with school groups and et cetera. But it doesn't typically do a lot to move that inspiration forward. So there's a lot of ways that community engagement can be really, really important, both to the success and safety of the field operation, but also to how well that operation serves society. So just to give an example of the safety considerations, this is a campaign that I did in 2011 called Dynamo, and we were there studying thunderstorms in the central Indian Ocean. We were in the country of the Maldives, and in that cultural context, one thing that the women were notified of is that we needed to dress perhaps more modestly than maybe we would think we would need to on a tropical island destination, um, to be respectful of the local culture. We complied with this, and I will admit, of course, we experienced frustration that this was something that only applied to women. But, as the picture in the upper right showed, I mean, it wasn't exactly a difficult request to comply with, but that those feelings were still there. That issue of how to um, deal with different cultural expectations is one that is extremely complex. Um, and there's a lot of thoughts about that, but and we can talk about that and if you so choose. So by the time we arrived, well, sorry, by the time I arrived, I got there about a month and a half into the beginning of field operations because I was taking over for my PhD advisor as science PI. And so by that time, a lot of the suspicions that we were basically American spies that some of the locals had been mostly smoothed over and things were going well. One team from a different instrument than the one I was helping to operate was even living in the local community, and the PI's daughter was actually attending the local school. And of course, we were there for months, and so we got to know the people at the businesses we visited, the people that we worked with and saw around the towns and the places that we stayed. Now, that became important because, unbeknownst to us until well into the campaign, political tensions within the country were rising very rapidly. And just after I departed the country, my instrument was done doing its sampling and we left, but another team was still in the country. A coup happened and massive social unrest followed. But, and this is a story that a colleague of mine told me about this experience, um, because the people knew us and knew who we were and what we were doing there, they mostly left us alone. Um, they saw it as their fight to have amongst themselves, and they didn't involve us in it. That team was still evacuated out of the country, of course. Um, but I would like to think that some aspect of that knowing us helped that from being a much worse situation than it could have been. And so it's like this is, kind of the earlier part of my career. In, the mid 20 teens, about 2015 or so, that was the begin of a massive sea change in how many of these issues were seen within the scientific community. And I think it was one that, caught a lot of people off guard. So it first started in 2015 in the astrophysics world when they began to be rocked by reports of rampant sexual harassment from prominent principal investigators within the field. And then, um, famously in 2017, there were allegations of sexual harassment by a very prominent scientist at the field station in Antarctica. And that really rocked the geology world. And it actually extended over into the atmospheric sciences, both there and in Greenland as well. And so this brought this issue of discrimination, sexual harassment, all that surging to the forefront within the scientific community. In that year, the American Geophysical Union changed its definition of the definition of scientific misconduct to include harassment and discrimination as part of that definition of scientific misconduct. So moving it from being HR an HR issue to a full bore scientific misconduct issue. And that was a huge move. Um, and that sea change, and during this time, Me Too was also gaining some major steam during this time period as well. And so there's many of us who were frankly getting a bit tired of the quietly known thing about some of these issues, not wanting them to be quiet anymore. And so me and some other colleagues had a major field campaign coming up in 2018, the following year. And we wanted a better structure to deal with these situations should they arise. And so we pushed the National Science Foundation to codify centralized reporting structures for incidents of harassment and discrimination for these multi-institutional campaigns. And the reason why this is important is because before that point, it was that, well, if you experience something like that, then you had to report to your institution, but the person who may have done it may be from a different institution subject to different rules, right? And so navigating all of that was extremely complicated. This was an effort to try to simplify it. And NSF did make those changes the following year in 2018. And so we didn't stop there. A group of primarily, but not solely, female principal investigators also set out to try to make a cultural shift in field campaign attitudes around discrimination and harassment. And so in the end, we created a series of training programs that we would conduct at the beginning of the major field campaigns that we were leads of during that year. And this is the paper that we published on this effort in 2021. And the whole idea of these pilot trainings was to address many of the issues that I brought up before. The actual dangers involved, the intensity, the stress, the conflicts of attitudes, cultures, and norms that can lead to both problematic behavior and misunderstandings that can, boil over into conflict in very high intensity situations. This was just a first, attempt to deal with some of these issues, and trying to handle some of these barriers towards equitable and accessible field operations in the atmospheric sciences. So that's very well and good. But that also brings us back around to that, social affair and how these campaigns engage with the community. And that brings us to the final issue I want to highlight, which is around the ethics in these kinds of field operations. So in the following years after that 2018 campaign, a lot more light was beginning to be shed on how inequitable the collection of environmental data and even the scientific questions that are asked have been towards certain communities. As an example, a colleague of mine, Marshall Shepard, who's also a co-author on this paper that I'm showing here, he wrote an article in Forbes highlighting how there's a massive hole in radar coverage in the southeastern United States, especially in the areas that are predominantly Black and rural in those states. That area is increasingly prone to deadly nighttime tornadoes, and so this is a literal matter of public safety. So this panel that I was on with Marshall and some others highlighted many of these shortcomings in the equity of the nation's weather, water, and climate services, and how we need to do a better job of both distributing these services equitably, involving and thoroughly integrating communities in these efforts, building capacity within those communities, and respecting community knowledge and expertise in culturally sensitive ways. So the importance of socially engaged research has become ever higher. Dealing with these issues have become even more important. And especially when we're thinking about issues around climate change, resilience, and sustainability, as that has become more politically charged over the years, that effort is even more important. So as we design the field campaigns of the future, we have to ask ourselves several things, but here's a few key things. For one, how are we coming up with the key questions of these campaigns? Are we meaningfully involving or co-creating these questions with the interested and affected communities in that process? Are we respecting community knowledge and meaningfully weaving it with our typical data collection? Are there better ways that we can do that? A big one, especially in the with all the questions that have come up recently with AI, are we collecting the data ethically? Are we sharing it ethically? What about data privacy? What about the environmental impact of both the collection and storage of all that data in our models and various other things? And then finally, and especially really thorny issue, who owns the data? Who gets access to it? Um, what does co-ownership of the data with those community groups look like? And does that conflict with ideas of open science? And if so, how do we settle those conflicts? So these are all things that I think, especially as some of these issues around data science have really grown, we have to really think about into the future. So where are we going from here? Well, in in recent years, I joined a campaign named Crocus, this community research on climate and urban science. Um, and this is a Department of Energy Urban Integrated Field Laboratory, one of five in the nation. And its key question is, how does Chicago's urban environment affect its climate? And so how does the built environment, the disparate nature of that built environment, all of that, how does that affect Chicago's experience and resilience towards climate change and climate extremes? One big motivation of this campaign is you can look at this graph here. This is showing Cook County on the map. You can see the different well, Cook County, the page, some of the other ones, and all the different numbers represent precipitation measurements done across the region. If you look at Cook County specifically, I wonder if you notice where the data holes are in terms of those measurements. And so one thing that we set out to do is that to well characterize what Chicago's environment even looks like to begin with, we have to get better measurements across the city. And because right now, as you may notice, almost all of those measurements are concentrated on the north side, right? So one requirement of these field laboratories, though, was that they must start with existing community partnerships, and that we have to work with those community organizations to create our questions and move forward on community priorities while advancing the science at the same time. So the overarching goal is to provide the observations, modeling, and scientific understanding for Chicago and its suburbs to understand how the urban environment impacts its climate and weather extremes and how that's expected to change. It's a very, very lofty goal. And how can we also, as a very important additional, how can we also see how those are disparate across Chicago and its surrounding community? Um, those are some very, very lofty goals, and figuring out how to do this has been a very, very interesting challenge. So we have a pretty involved measurement strategy um, that is a mixture of a curation of existing data sets, so ones that are collected by, say, the National Weather Service all the time, um, creating an additional set of measurements, both creating a micronet that's taking long-term measurements throughout the city, and also community data collection, so involving the community itself with um, those measurement priorities towards the questions that they themselves have in terms of what's going on with their community. And then interspersed between all of that are the very episodic field operations where we collect very intensive measurements with a whole lot of instruments. In that field campaign operation, we have to balance two very important things. The first, providing a safe environment to collect these observations with, students both locally and from, different universities that may be further afield, and making sure that is a positive learning experience for those students while we're also getting the data that we need. And then also, how do we integrate those efforts with involving the community, making sure we're actually meeting those priorities, making sure that we're actually building capacity and getting that information out in a way that can be used. So that is a very, very complex and labor intensive effort that, I mean, I'll be honest, so these two images were taken from our very first just short 2-week campaign that we did this past summer. And it was a lot of lessons learned. We had to learn, we typically do these campaigns out in very rural areas where the population density is very low. Figuring out how to do these operations appropriately in a dense urban environment is a challenge in and of itself. Doing it safely with the heat and the storms and the flooding and all this other stuff, that's another significant challenge. Dealing with different cultural expectations and all that, that's a significant challenge. And so we're all in the process of pretty much figuring this out as we go along. And so the take-home message here is that there has been a lot of progress in figuring out some of the things around some of the more physical hardships of field campaigns. The psychological and social issues have taken a lot more time, but there is growing awareness around this, and we need to keep that going. There has been increasing awareness of the need to merge the physical with the social in these field operations, but the how is so tricky. And I think one thing I would love to see is to have more active merging between the physical and social sciences in the efforts when we do these things. And then finally, as I said, there's increasing ethical complexities of how to best work with communities, especially as we're moving a lot of these operations into, these very, very large operations into cities. And there are growing efforts to figure it out, how to do it well, but there's still a long way to go. And for that, I do want to thank, these are the 3 funding agencies that have funded a lot of the campaigns that I've been on throughout my career. And it's been a learning journey through it all. And I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts that you have at this time. Thanks.
Wow, yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. One thing that I sort of picked up on was how the structural discrimination has impacted your science and like the Cook County area, and how you don't have data on rain from a specific area in Chicago because of that. And so now I'm, thinking about how that might have impacted other types of science that I've studied in my career. So yeah, really interesting. So yeah, we are taking questions now. You can type those into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. Even if you just have like a comment, you want to chat a little bit, that's fine too. Maybe let's start with one that I have that's more of like, what are ways that we can encourage the positive interactions when we're out in the field? Like, how can we ourselves impact that?
Are you talking more are you talking more like within your teams or with the broader communities, or yes, or
Yeah, maybe both. I was thinking in team interactions, but yeah, maybe if you want to look at community interactions too, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think when you're, as far as the team is concerned, there are a few things that I've observed that really, really help. The first is having clear chains of command. Frankly, And one reason why that becomes important is because, again, people agreeing to a particular decision-making structure um, is really important. One thing that I like to say is that there's nothing more dangerous than a group of bored and desperate scientists. And so it's really common within the atmospheric sciences, for example, you do all this planning, you get all this money, you do all this work to get your instrumentation to the field, and then the weather that you're trying to study doesn't show up. And you get what we call a ridge of death, or if you're trying to study heat, then suddenly it becomes the coldest and wettest summer that you've ever seen, or whatever. And so then people start getting bored, they start getting frustrated that they're not getting the data they need. Those are the kind of situations where a lot of conflicts can start to arise. And so having a clear decision-making structure from the jump that everyone agrees to and has had input in making really, really helps. On the more social side, I think some of the things that to consider now, one thing that's interesting about the atmospheric sciences, I will say, is that we have a wide variety of ways that people can be involved. They can be in an operations center where they're helping with forecasting or looking at observations on the ground. They can be in, ground crews, air crews, like whatever. What that means is that the level of physical accessibility can be wider, right? And the range of opportunities can be wider. Um, I've known that especially like geology or fields that rely heavily on like trekking into the wilds, which is a very physically intensive thing, that can be a challenge. Or for example, wanting to involve people in a field campaign, but maybe they can't dedicate being away from home for 6 weeks, right? And so how do you create different levels of intensity for interaction so that people who may not have as much freedom to fly off to wherever for, weeks, months, whatever, can still be involved and still get something out of it, but not in such a way that's so demanding. Um, so that's one thing to think about. On the social side, again, things like if the answer to everyone, so let's do a social thing, like, oh, let's go play a sport. Well, some people may not be able to play that sport, let alone be interested, or let's go to a bar. That can be really problematic for any number of reasons. And so thinking about um, a multitude of different ways for people to interact in a way that can still create that bonding, but also keep things at an appropriate level and be accessible to a wide number of people. Um, those are some of the things that I've seen help. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. From our chat, one of our participants says, "Thank you so much. I'm curious if you have recommendations for specific resources or training for preparing yourself and navigating the difficulties of the field research. I do quite a bit of field research, but I feel that my institution has few resources and trainings accessible to me and my team, from weather and risks to navigating interpersonal and public interactions."
Yeah, that's a really great question. There it's interesting because I can think of different things that deal with different aspects of this. I'm not sure, even though it's a good question. I might have to go tool around and see if anyone's actually tried to put all this together in one place. But so in terms of dealing, like say for example, like with what is the kind of the weather, the climate, those kind of things. Um, well, okay, actually taking a step back. Some of this does depend on who and what and how your field campaign is being managed. So some campaigns are actively engaging a logistics, an outfit that specializes in field campaign logistics, and they can often be a wealth of knowledge and how to deal with everything from, cultural differences to getting your visas to, all those kind of nitty gritty, how are you going to live in a place? Um, the cultural aspects can sometimes, however, be lacking. And so I do think, um, even something as basic as, picking up travel guides and stuff for, the places that you're going, so that you can make sure that you're culturally aware, is important. You're lucky if someone actually puts that together for you. And in the case of when we were going to Dynamo, in the Maldives, um, the NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, actually has an outfit that specializes in field campaign operations. They put a lot of this stuff together for us, but sometimes you have that, sometimes you don't. Um, the training materials for some of these things around harassment and discrimination, that is stuff that, that does exist and can probably point you to that. Um, and the navigating and a lot of that stuff has, it's again kind of more focused on uh how does one navigate these kind of intense interpersonal interactions, and that, that has, inherently discrimination and harassment component to it. And then the public interactions, there has been some really great work actually by someone in family science here, where she's done a lot of, she and other people have done quite a bit of research around how do we move from the kind of very unidirectional, outward-facing outreach model to a fully more multi-way interaction community co-created type of model. And there's many different levels in between those two extremes. The challenge there can very well be time and resources and money. And so one huge thing that I should also mention, another answer to Elizabeth's question earlier, is that planning for this stuff in advance and allocating sufficient resources to putting this stuff together and to doing this well is an incredibly important part of the field campaign planning process. And that's the part that can frequently be overlooked when you're trying to squeeze, okay, how am I going to do all this stuff, with all this instrumentation and people that may be very well expensive? Okay, well, sometimes the last line item that can be considered is the community part, right? And so thinking about how to more incorporate that into your plan throughout and getting those people involved early in the planning process throughout is an important part of pulling a lot of that together. But yeah, I'll think about if I can find if if anyone has actually pulled a lot of the stuff into a nice package. I'll think about that one.
Yeah, thanks. We are a couple minutes past the hour. We did have one more come in. Are you able, and willing and have time to address another one, or, do we need to close?
Yeah, I think I can.
Okay.
I think
Let me read it for the recording and then, let's see. So what are your recommended strategies for dealing with the power imbalance between graduate supervisor and graduate student, or any kind of supervisor-employee relationship? This kind of relationship can put those with less received power in a position to agree to things that they may not be comfortable with.
absolutely, and I'll answer this one briefly, because this one's got a long answer. But absolutely, this is the both one of the biggest roots of the difficulty and uh one of the biggest challenges. And um again, a big part of this is um a few different things. For one, I mean, and this applies both within the field campaign context, but also, throughout your graduate student career. For one, getting those expectations laid out with your advisor in it, from the beginning in advance, or I mean, if you haven't done it by, now, then doing it now, um, can really help, you know, can really be helpful in um, establishing those expectations from the beginning. Um, and so, coming up with with a plan of, okay, what are going to be my duties? What's my time, my free time going to look like? What's my, whatever, when you're out in the field, getting all that laid out so that going in what it's going to look like. And if you disagree with it, that it can be addressed. Um, Now, how do you get your supervisor to do that? Um, uh, that is a good question. I would hope that that is a conversation that your supervisor is willing to undertake, just because it's the nature of laying out what your job is. Um, and then also, one thing that has, I think, been extremely helpful, has been that the students and trainees coming together and um, and as a group putting together their concerns or their requests for information or whatever it may be, um, to the campaign leads to make sure um, that they're aware of what possible problems, concerns, challenges, et cetera, that there may be. Because there's often, frequently safety in numbers. And also you can um, help the PIs be aware of how they need to adapt the overarching campaign structure. Those are just a couple ways. I wish I could go on a long time about this one. But it is a challenge, and it is one that it was one that really formed the root of us getting to the bottom of the paper that I mentioned before about the the uh, the pilot trainings that we did, was exactly motivated by this issue.
Great, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this very important issue. And I don't know if you want to close us out with any remarks or.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I will say is just like I hope this doesn't discourage anyone from wanting to take part in these efforts. They are some of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. It does come with challenges. But I think especially as the mood and the attitudes have changed, there's so many opportunities to have a really positive impact on how these are done in the future. And I look forward to seeing what people come up with.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. Take care, y'all.